Great. So welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, January 20th, 2023. And my name is Heather Kraus. I am so excited that you're here with us today. Talking Data Equity is something that the We All Count project does. The We All Count project focuses on how to align the choices that we're making when we are doing anything with quantitative data, how to align those choices with the equity priorities and goals of the project that we're working on. And just to answer your logistical questions right up front, yes, this is being recorded, and that recording is going to be shared. I'm going to share with you in the link in the chat. Whoops. No, I am not. I'm going to share with you in the chat shortly. All right, so today we are going to be talking about Bayesian methods and data equity. And how this works is that I'm going to talk for as short of a time as possible, just to give you a general idea of what we mean by Bayesian methods and how that can impact equity. And while I talk for a couple of minutes and share some slides, we are going to ask that you remain muted at that time. But at any point when I'm talking or not talking, you can feel free to share broadly in the chat. And there are two ways that you can put things into the chat. The first is by using the blue drop-down menu set to everyone, which means everybody who's here will be able to see your chat and your name. Or if you want to ask a question or make a comment privately, just use the drop-down menu set to my name, which is Heather Kraus. And we are going to share the link to this recording. There we go. We finally got the chat sorted out. The link to this recording and all of the resources that I talk about today will all be shared on the We All Count Data Equity Forum. That's not a membership site. It's just an online public forum where you can share resources and ask questions. All right, so housekeeping over, let's talk about Bayesian methods. The whole point of talking about Bayesian methods is not to get into a heated debate, war, fight about what we should or should not do with quantitative data or with statistics. The point of talking about Bayesian methods, Bayesian analysis, is to continue as a group of practitioners, as a community, to come together and explore every possible tool that we can use to make sure that we are getting the most accurate, the most replicable, the most rigorous, and the most equitable results in our data projects. So that's why we're here, not to have a fight, but to come together to see how we can learn to use these tools. So what even is Bayesian analysis? There's lots of different people here. Some people are statisticians who have been talking about Bayesian analysis for a long time. Some people here are like frontline workers at a homeless shelter that have heard this word and they want to know, what are we talking about? So Bayesian analysis is yet another way of trying to make meaning out of what's going on in the world by collecting some numbers and doing some stuff to those numbers. So a Bayesian analysis is a model, just like lots of other mathematical models or data models that we've talked about. Broad strokes, you can think about a model as collecting some data, putting that data through some kind of a recipe, and then getting an answer out of that recipe. And when you're doing this with a Bayesian recipe, essentially the recipe that you're adding to your data is an indication of what you think is probably already real, plus some kind of specification of a model. So a Bayesian recipe is pretty straightforward. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it's pretty straightforward to think about. Essentially, we put in a combination of what we think is probably going on, a specification of a model, we combine that with some data, and we get an answer. And the answer that comes out of our recipe, the cake that comes out of a Bayesian analysis, is something like the relative credibilities of the parameter values. So the answer is what is probably happening given the combination of the new data that we acquired and the ideas that we came in with. So that's still pretty abstract. So let's think about this a little more before we dive into an example. So essentially, a Bayesian analysis, a Bayesian recipe, when we're cooking with Bayesian, we are essentially looking at a bunch of possibilities, a bunch of possible answers to the question that we're trying to answer. We're eliminating the ones that are probably false based on experience and knowledge. Then we're using data to choose which one of the remaining possibilities are probably real. You can think of this a lot like a detective story. I don't know if you like detective stories. I love detective stories. So most detective stories start with some kind of a case and then a set of candidates who might have been the person who did the crime. And at the beginning of the detective story, some suspects seem very suspicious. It's very likely that they've done it. And some people don't even count as suspects. And then what makes a detective novel fun is that the person in the end who did it may be somebody who you didn't think at the beginning was probably guilty. And what happens during a detective story is that the detective does their work. The detective collects new information, goes around and gets clues. And kind of the parallel, you can think of the statistician or the data analysis or you. Instead of going around and collecting new clues, you're going around and you're collecting new data. And then in the detective story, you take the clues that you've gathered throughout the book, along with those suspicions that you had at the beginning of the book, and you figure out by the end who did the crime. Same thing with Bayesian analysis. We take some ideas of what is likely, who's likely to be the culprit. We collect a bunch of new data. We put these things together in a precise mathematical way. And then we get at the end who is most likely to be the culprit. Statistics aren't quite as straightforward as a fictional detective story, whereas a fictional detective story, we get to know with 100% certainty this is who did it. We wish that we got that in statistics. We don't get that in statistics. Assumptions plus data. Absolutely. You have all kinds of Bayesian analysis already working in your life. You are living and breathing in a Bayesian world. For example, if you use email and you have a spam filter, so there's any kind of a algorithm or program running in the back that's kind of deciding which one of your emails is likely spam, not always, but probably that spam filter is running a Bayesian analysis. That spam filter has an idea of what a legitimate email to you looks like, and it has an idea of what a spam email to you probably looks like, and then it sorts them into those two baskets, and it's using ideas that it had before. So, Google asks you if you use Gmail to star messages sometimes that are really important. That helps that spam filter come into its analysis with an idea of whether that email is a good guy or a bad guy, just like with the detectives. So let's get a little more specific about the details of the Bayesian recipe. Assumptions plus data is in the chat. That's an extremely good way to frame it. So what are some of the more technical details? So what you put into a Bayesian analysis is something that most people call a prior. And what you get out of a Bayesian analysis is what some people call a posterior. And what you actually put into a Bayesian analysis is a prior. which is a synonym for what we think is already probably real. And then, of course, you combine it with a second thing, which is new data. So what goes into a Bayesian analysis is a prior plus data. A prior is how we tell a Bayesian analysis what our suspicions are, what we believe to be likely true in the situation we're in. And then, of course, the big question that this leads to is, where does this information come from? That is like the big glaring neon sign. Where's this information come from? If we already know the answer to this question, why are we trying to answer this question with data anyways? So where this information comes from will depend. It will depend on the type of analysis you're doing. It can come from other research. It can come from experts. It can come from people with lived experience. And the thing that comes out when you combine your prior with your data, the thing that comes out is a posterior. And posterior is short for other longer words, but essentially it's a posterior distribution. It's the probability of different effects given the observed data, resulting in a distribution of possible values for the parameter called the posterior distribution. We're going to look in a minute what that means, if those words aren't familiar to you. One of the words to know is that sometimes what comes out and the way to make meaning of what comes out of a Bayesian analysis is called a credible interval or a credibility interval. There's different words depending on what country you're in, what sector you're in, what discipline you're in. But essentially, what comes out of a Bayesian analysis is a distribution of how likely it is that we have evidence to support different answers. So I'm going to show you a high level example. we spent a lot of time deciding like how technical we should get in the example. And we have lots of very, very technical examples in our community forum that you can download and look at. And we tried to choose like a middle of the road example here. So I live in Canada, and one interesting, important question is what's going on with unmet postpartum needs in Canada. Postpartum means after having a baby, among recent immigrants to Canada. So we know that there are people who have arrived in Canada recently, and after they have a baby, they experience unmet medical needs. And of course, it's important for us to figure out what's going on with this so that we can create policy, so that we can make changes to address this unmet need. One of the ways that we can do this is by doing some Bayesian analysis, because there's a lot of data and there's a lot of opinions. So Bayesian analysis is a way to combine expertise, lived experience, previous research, and new data. So this is a great opportunity to do this. So that is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at the articles that have been published, peer-reviewed literature. We're going to talk to subject matter experts, and we're going to talk to people with lived experience. And the literature review says, and I am simplifying a very complicated piece of work, but some of the things that the literature review says are associated with this unmet need are having a cesarean section, experiencing poverty, having less than a high school diploma. The subject matter experts and the people with lived experience agree. They say, absolutely, we think those things matter. And they think that having a poor relationship with the medical provider also impacts your level of unmet need, as well as experiencing medical discrimination. So again, this is where we gather assumptions and input, and we can collect very specific probabilities. This is where we kind of can take the assumptions, the ideas, the experience, and transform it into numbers. So in this case, for this particular piece of research, the people conducting the research transferred it into odds. So it was able to be compared. So in the literature review, the literature said the odds of having unmet postpartum needs if you've had a cesarean are about 1.4. Family doctors said it was about 0.46. People with lived experience said it was about 0.8. So you can see that there's a lot of different opinions about what the relationship is like between having a cesarean and having unmet postpartum needs if you're a recent immigrant to Canada. And then there are lots of different specific algorithms, specific kind of ways to take an average or ways to combine these opinions to get a single number or a single distribution. You can put in a distribution, but in our example, we're going to put in a number, and that number is 0.65. So what these researchers did was they combined the lit review, the family doctor's opinion, the people with lived experience, and they said, we think that the relationship between having a cesarean and having unmet postpartum needs is about 0.65. And we're going to take the data we have, the new data that we've collected, we're going to combine it with this 0.65, and we're going to calculate. We're going to find out how likely it is that you have unmet needs for people who have had a cesarean, for people who haven't. And again, for simplicity, I'm just going to tell you the single kind of point, the single odds that they came up with was 0.39. And the reason I'm just going to tell you a single number, what would really come out of a Bayesian model is a distribution of numbers. So the 0.39 is the most likely number, but there's a lot of other related numbers. But the reason I'm going to tell you this 0.39 is so we can compare it to this 0.31. 0.31 is the number if we only take the new data and we don't condition the new data on anybody's opinion, not the literature opinion, not the family doctor opinion, not the lived experience. We get 0.31. So you get different, the evidence that comes out of a Bayesian analysis is different than the evidence that comes out of an analysis that only uses the data. I'm just going to really quickly go through another part of this same research so you can see that it doesn't have to only be about something like, did they have a cesarean or not? One of the things that was quite interesting was that medical discrimination came up a lot in the conversations that the researchers had with family doctors and people with lived experience. Medical discrimination was not measured. There were no previous quantitative studies that they could find about medical discrimination. There was lots of qualitative studies, but there was no quantitative studies. So in this case, they needed to combine two pieces of information from people who have different types of lived experience, medical or as a non-medical participant. And again, they combine it through a system of weighting, taking an average, figuring it out. And you can see in this case, when they collected new data and they did two types of analysis, one where the new data is analyzed, including conditioning it on people's previous experience, we get 0.66. And when we analyze the new data without including the new people's the new information about lived experiences, previous assumptions, we get a very different number. So that's an example of what it can look like to do Bayesian analysis. And some of you, for sure, are already saying this is extremely subjective. Like, what? How can you possibly include somebody's opinion in a statistical model? And the answer to that is that we are all doing that, no matter what kind of a model we're doing, whether we're using a frequentist model or a Bayesian model. We are all incorporating opinions into that model. What's different about a Bayesian model is the way that it incorporates opinions. So a Bayesian model, as we've talked about, quantifies the different opinions, such as what are the relationships between having a cesarean and having unmet need, and the specification of the model. What people often refer to as like regular statistics is something that's called frequentist statistics. And this recipe is also full of subjectivity, but it's often subjectivity that isn't always clearly and explicitly defined. You have to form a hypothesis. Somebody in the chat is saying, is an assumption like a hypothesis? Kind of. You have to craft a definition of chance, which is essential to what p-value you get. You can analyze the same question with the same data and get very different p-values depending on how you define chance, and whether you use a 1 or 2 tailed p-value. You can see our whole hour on p-values and statistical significance if you want to see some examples. And there's all kinds of adjustments and things like that. So Frank Harrell, who has some great pieces about Bayesian analysis, which we link to in our community, summarizes it something like this. This isn't exactly how Frank Harrell does it, but essentially frequentist analysis, the recipe is a subjective choice, number 1, plus subjective choice, number 2, plus some objectivity and data. Bayesian analysis has the same first subjective choice, which is the choice of the data model, but it has a very different second subjective choice. So the reason I'm sharing this is really to just emphasize that when somebody says to you, well, the difference between Bayesian and frequentist is that Bayesian analysis incorporates assumptions and subjectivity, while frequentist doesn't. That is not an accurate characterization. Both Bayesian analysis and frequentist analysis, and any other kind of statistical analysis you might be involved with, they all incorporate external assumptions. They all incorporate subjectivity. The difference is how and where they incorporate subjectivity and whose subjectivity. One of the really good things for equity, which we're going to talk about in a second, is that Bayesian analysis is much more effective at incorporating not just the statistician's subjectivity, but also the subjectivity of the people who are experiencing whatever it is that you are trying to measure, whether it's healthcare, like the example I shared, or whether it's learning to read, whether it's having an impact in your transportation systems. So Bayesian methods are not perfect. I am in no way doing this talking data equity to say Bayesian is much better. But Bayesian is very interesting. And it is absolutely possible to do unscientific, non-reproducible, not equitable research using any paradigm. This is true of Bayesian. This is true of frequentist. There is no cure-all statistical methodology that is going to make your data scientific, rigorous, and always correct. However, there are some very interesting things you can do with Bayesian analysis that you can't do with frequentist analysis. And the last thing I'm going to say before I turn it to a lot of the questions in the chat are, why are so many people talking about Bayesian analysis now, and why would we bother? Why would we bother? We've already talked a lot about. In terms of data equity, the number one reason we would bother is the possibility of introducing prior knowledge into the analysis in an explicit, systematic, and rigorous way. That's the number one reason that you would do Bayesian analysis from an equity perspective. The number two reason to do Bayesian analysis from an equity perspective has to do with what comes out of the results. So what comes out of a Bayesian analysis, again, is a credibility interval. So what comes out of a Bayesian analysis is how likely it is that the various possible results are really happening in the world. What comes out of Bayesian analysis is what most of us wish came out of a frequentist analysis. So if you're doing an analysis that says how much of a change is our new economic policy having on people's income, and we find out that we do a frequentist analysis, and we find out that I'll just go up here. And yeah, let's say that we do a frequentist analysis of the change that our new economic policy is having. And that frequentist analysis shows us that the confidence interval for the average treatment effect, or the average change that our policy is having, is like 100.75 to 109.26. The way we want to, and we've talked about this before, most of us want to say that means that there's a 90% probability that that's where the treatment effect falls, right? If you're doing a frequentist analysis, unfortunately, no, that is not the way that you can interpret this interval. But if you've done a Bayesian analysis and you get that for your Bayesian credible interval, then it is the right way to interpret it. A Bayesian analysis, the numbers or the distribution or the posterior that comes out of a Bayesian analysis actually answers the question that you probably have, which is how likely is this result to be true? And that is very important for data equity, not only for your own sake, but also because a lot of people that probably need to interpret your results are not statisticians. And even if they are statisticians, they might not be interpreting these frequentist p-values and confidence intervals correctly. And then the last thing I'll say about why bother is what we talked about last Friday, which is Bayesian analysis can often be really useful when you have a small sample size. If you have a small population, if you have a group of indigenous people, or you have a group of people who identify as transgender, it can be very challenging to make meaning from a single small sample. But if we can take that small sample and incorporate some of the wisdom and understanding that comes from lived experience, that helps us make meaning from these essential small populations. Okay, last thing I'm going to say is why now? Bayesian analysis is not a new idea. It's not a new technique, but it is really getting a lot more attention recently. I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is philosophical and kind of cultural. There is a widespread disenchantment with the whole p-value approach. Even the American Statistical Association, I know not all of you are American, but if you are American, has written a lot about the problems with p-values, and that they are not always answering the questions we think, and they're not always great for science. And so people are thinking, well, what are we going to do? Another reason, another kind of cultural, philosophical reason, is that now we have repeated demonstrations that Bayesian analysis works. It's not just something untested. It's not just a theory. There's lots and lots of reproducible research that is saying, hey, this type of method actually does give us usable answers that can move the needle, especially in practice, especially in things like policy, the what works movement in education and health. And it doesn't hurt that there are a lot of corporations using Bayesian analysis to make a ton of money. So that always attracts interest in most economic situations. Another reason is sociological. For a long time, statistics was controlled by a very small group of men. And most of those group of men were not down for this. And one of the great things about more and more people becoming statisticians or data analysts or economists or people that learn to work with data is that we're not just stuck being heavily influenced by the opinions of like 4 or 5 people. We have a much more democratized system of, it's got a long way to go. It's not an equitable system yet, but it's making progress. So there are some sociological reasons that Bayesian analysis is making a breakthrough. And then this one might be the most important, that's computational. To do a Bayesian analysis requires your computer to have a lot of power. And that used to be something only a very few wealthy people in academic or industrial settings had. But now if you have like a laptop, there's a reasonably good chance that you can do Bayesian analysis on a laptop. There's links that we're going to share about how to do Bayesian analysis in Excel and Tableau and things like that. So that might be, depending on your philosophy of how the world works and why change happens, the actual computational ability might actually be the reason that it's breaking through. Last thing I'm going to say is things to work on as a community, because I know that's one of the things we like to talk about on Fridays is how, if we want to use Bayesian, what do we have to do? And one thing is to continue to learn ourselves how to do it. We've put in the community a couple of links to free online courses. They're not fast, they're not easy, but they are free and available. There are courses to learn how to do it. Unlearning the whole commitment to frequentist ideals can be challenging. Secondly, we need to continue to work with and talk with and inform funders and regulators how important Bayesian methods are so that they can be seen as credible evidence, and to build a business case that additional resources are worth it. Now, Bayesian analysis doesn't inherently require more time or money than frequentist analysis. But if you're used to doing frequentist analysis, you might need some extra training or a little bit of extra time. And then some of the really complicated systems need to get some user-friendly tools to help us figure out how to develop those priors, that part of the recipe that mathematically kind of contains previous experience. So yes, there's so many things I want to respond to in the chat. So I'm going to stop talking, and weallcount.com is like the home of all things all things data equity. I just really want to stop talking and hear what's going on in the chat. Because there is a ton going on in the chat. Okay, fabulous. So now comes my favorite part, which is I'm going to go through the chat and take questions. But if you're in the room and you want to raise your hand and ask a question, this is also a great time to do that. And if you want to ask a question, remember, you can ask it publicly by using the drop-down menu set to everyone. Or if you feel shy and you want to just ask the question directly to me, just find my name in the drop-down menu. My name is Heather Kraus, and you can ask me privately. And somebody is suggesting the book Statistical Rethinking by Richard I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Richard McKell. McKellreath. Anyways, apologies. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. It is a fantastic resource. We actually in our community forum have links to all of his lectures and notes and exercises, which he makes available for free. McKellreath. Great. Thank you. And if anybody knows Richard and can recruit Richard to come and do a Talking Data Equity, absolutely send me a message. It's a paid gig. We would pay Richard to come and talk with us. So I highly recommend that. And absolutely. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to try and choose some of the questions that many people have asked. And one of them, okay. A lot of you are asking whether this is mixed methods design. And hand in hand with that goes the question, how, like in the example of the unmet need for postpartum care, how was that information gathered, say, from the family physicians and the people with lived experience? So my answer to the first question is the same as what Dr. Bustos, again, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Feel free to correct me in the chat, is saying is that no, I would not consider this a mixed method. This is a quantitative method. And it's every bit as quantitative as frequentist statistics. The people who think that this is a mixed method are often usually still thinking, well, Bayesian methods have a lot more subjectivity in them than frequentist methods. And that's a misunderstanding. Not a misunderstanding of Bayesian analysis, a misunderstanding of frequentist analysis. That frequentist analysis has a tremendous amount of subjectivity baked into it, but not always as transparently and honestly as Bayesian methods. The example of how you actually quantitatively define chance is a hugely subjective element of a frequentist analysis. So for example, if I'm doing a pay equity analysis and we want to know if the difference in pay between Black women and white men is in this company is happening by chance or maybe a sign of problematic compensation practices, how I have one data set from that company, the p-value that I get to that question, whether or not it's by chance or whether it's by problematic practices, entirely depends on how we define chance. So most people would set up something called a null hypothesis, which means that chance means there's no difference at all, and anything else is not a problem. And of course, we all know that that's a very subjective decision and very unlikely to be true. Second question is about how to actually do Bayesian analysis, how to actually get information about those priors. And that is a fantastic question. Essentially, you need to do literature review, and the literature that you want to include is, of course, the literature that matters to you. It doesn't have to be the literature that matters to other people. It needs to be the literature that matters to your project. And then in the example that I gave, and in most all the other examples I know, the family doctors and the people with lived experience of unmet postpartum needs in Canada, conversations, talking to people. You can, if there's a few people, you can just speak directly to them. If there's a lot of people, you can do a survey. If there is a hard to reach population, there are many different ways to kind of gather input from a group of people on a specific topic. And the microscope tool that We All Count uses as part of the data equity framework can be a really useful starting point, because one of the temptations that we often have when we're trying to keep a piece of research rigorous and accurate is that we have a temptation to speak to people in very clinical, hard to understand, jargony terms. With the idea that as long as we speak with these fancy words, our results are going to be rigorous and accurate. And when you say that out loud, you can realize fancy words do not create accuracy or get more rigorous results. So learning a couple of grounded tools that you can use to get input from people who have a tremendous amount of lived experience can actually increase the accuracy of your work. Another person, yes, some in the chat, a couple of people are asking, Nate Silver. Some of you might know who Nate Silver is. Nate Silver is the person who used to work for himself, and then he worked for the New York Times, and now I haven't been following his career lately, but I think he works for ESPN on his own site called 538. He has an excellent book called The Signal and the Noise. And in that book, he tells very interesting stories about how the relationship between smoking cigarettes and humans getting lung cancer, the understanding, the scientific clinical understanding and the accompanying laws and policies were dramatically slowed down by the refusal to accept and incorporate a Bayesian way of thinking. That, like, a lot of people, a lot of doctors knew that this was happening. But a rejection of mathematical rigorous ways to incorporate that into medical research cost the lives of many, many people. So The Signal and the Noise, it's a long book, but it's an interesting book. Might be useful to you. Okay, what if there aren't clear priors? Fantastic question. Because lots of times there aren't clear priors. So the example that's being given is the evaluation of effectiveness of a specific program at a specific organization. So there's a couple of different answers to this, and it depends on, one of the things that it depends on is thinking beforehand about who is going to benefit or who's going to suffer if you get it wrong. And that's a really important question that we often forget to think about when we're setting up models. So if there's no really clear prior that's going to apply in your specific context, in your specific situation, there's a couple of different things you can do in Bayesian analysis. I don't want to get too technical, but there's names for different kinds of priors. There are uninformative priors, there are informative priors, there are strongly informative priors. What those words mean is a strongly informative prior is basically a prior that you really want to have carry a lot of weight, like it's really going to inform the analysis you're going to do. If you don't have rigorous or reliable previous information that you necessarily want to incorporate into your Bayesian analysis, but you still want all the other advantages of Bayesian analysis, like you want to get output that is a credible interval rather than a confidence interval so that it's interpretable, you can do something called a non-informative prior. And I'm not going to go into the technical details of it right now, but essentially you can choose a distribution of numbers that is pretty close to like neutral. So you do have to make some amount of decision about what neutral might mean for your particular situation. Or you might want to do something that's not entirely neutral, but might limit it. Like if you're trying to ask about the effectiveness of your specific program, and you want to limit the answers to like how much somebody's financial stability went up, and say you want to limit the possible results to like 5% to 95%, because those are the realistic possibilities. You can do something like that, which isn't the same as like doing tons and tons of work of interviewing people and making an estimate of what you think is actually happening in your program. So there's lots of levels of priors that you can attach to the beginning of a Bayesian analysis. It doesn't all have to be quite as complex as the example that I showed you. Yes. Fabulous. Let's see. I'm trying to get to some of the earlier questions. How do you talk to your boss? Yeah, this is always a really, really good question. First of all, how do you talk to your boss about this is find common ground. Find something that you and your boss both want to achieve through the analysis that you're trying to do, whether it's an understanding or whether it's the ability to know where to put strategic funds, or the ability to apply for a grant. Figure out what you both want, and then make your pitch for how Bayesian analysis is going to be good for the common goal that you both have. Also, don't be afraid to show some examples. There are more and more examples up here. Yeah. So another important question is in the example about postpartum unmet medical need from recent immigrants in Canada, were you able to talk to family doctors, to people with lived experience about things like odds ratios? I didn't do that particular piece of research, but I've done really similar research, and the answer is no. You can talk to almost no one about odds ratios, realistically, but you don't have to. When you're collecting lived experience or experts or subject matter experience that you want to incorporate, sometimes it's enough just to ask somebody to really say something like, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think having a cesarean section, I'm going to just stick with that example, having a cesarean section would be one of the strongest factors associated with unmet need, not affected at all with their unmet needs? Or do you think it might be a 2, 3, or 4 on that scale between 1 to 5? Like, you can say something like that, and you don't even actually need to do it in language. You can, I mean, in words, you can bring pictures. We're just about to publish a tool, which we'll share with you in about probably second week in February. That's literally like concentric circles, almost like a bullseye, where you just ask somebody to draw a circle in the relationship that you're thinking about. So if you have had a cesarean, do you think that on this scale of concentric circles, how strongly do you think the fact that you had a cesarean influenced your unmet need for postpartum care? There's a couple of questions about what types of algorithms you would use, what types of weighting you would use to combine all this information. So let's say you do have information from previous research, previous literature, and maybe subject matter experts and people with lived experience. I'm not going to go into exactly how you would, mostly because I'm not an expert at that. Like, I don't want to lead you astray. I've done it maybe once or twice, and I think the way that you would do it has to do with figuring out which types of previous assumptions you want to weigh the most strongly. Which types of previous assumptions do you think are most precise or most specific? And then putting, if you think, I don't want to use too technical of words, like think of like attaching weights to each source of incoming knowledge that you have, and attaching weights by which you think is most precise, which you think is most accurate, which you think is most important. And then also keeping in the back of your mind the thing that we said about who is most at risk if you get it wrong. Like, do you want to lean one direction or lean the other direction, depending on what's going to happen? And then there is a thing called sensitivity analysis. Once you've built your model, there is a way to conduct something called a sensitivity analysis, which helps you understand how different your results are because of the prior you incorporated. So most people won't have the time to do a whole frequentist analysis and a whole Bayesian analysis unless you're specifically trying to do research about like comparing and contrasting. And there are a couple of examples of that we've added into the community. But even if you're just doing a Bayesian analysis, you can do a sensitivity analysis to see how different your results are because of your priors, because of the assumptions that you put in. And that can kind of maybe make you relax a little bit and breathe out when you see like how different it is. All right. Oh, I have seen papers that argue that multi-level models are what we should all be doing when doing equity analysis. Do you have thoughts about the shrinkage effect of the Bayesian multi-level models on inference and subsequent illumination of disparities? It seems like shrinkage might understate disparities. That's a fantastic question. Actually, there is a person here, is a guest that could 100% answer that question with great accuracy. And maybe I'll get that person to come and answer that question in our community forum. I will take a shot at it, which is essentially, I am a huge fan of multi-level models. For people who don't know that technical term, a multi-level model is a way to combine data that allows information that we have to draw strength from other information we have. So if we're doing research on, does this new way of teaching reading work for children? We take information about the individual children, and we also kind of acknowledge the fact that those children are clumped together in classrooms, and those classrooms are clumped together in schools. And we can kind of share knowledge between children, between classrooms, and between schools. And that is what the person in the comments is calling shrinkage. So we might think, well, we don't know anything. And that's like, we have a lot of uncertainty. We can get a little bit more certain. We can shrink stuff down and get more and more certain by borrowing knowledge and insight from other kind of data points in our model. And how is that good or bad for equity is a really important question. And again, it really depends on what question you're trying to ask. Whether you're trying to get a really accurate understanding about the differences within a group or the differences between a group. And both of those are really, really important equity questions. And whichever one of those is more important to answer for your project is going to determine whether or not you want to use multi-level models, Bayesian multi-level models, and if so, how you want to specify that model. Whether you want to use something called contextual effects, which can help with some of that biased shrinkage issue. So great question. I am going to try and get an answer, a longer, more expert answer to that question in our community forum, because like I said, we do have an expert. And fabulous. We have to leave it there because we do our very best to end at 5 minutes before the hour so that all of us who have the top of the hour meetings have 5 minutes to take a breath, get some water. We have just scratched the surface of Bayesian analysis and how it relates to equity. Like I said, we will post this recording and a whole bunch of resources in this link here, which is the We All Count Community Forum. That's not a membership site. You don't have to pay money to belong to that site. And it's public. And we hope that you will add resources to that site because already I've seen tons of Bayesian analysis resources that I didn't know existed. Please add those to the forum. Where the whole community really needs to have access to as many tools as possible. Feel free to ask the questions that didn't get answered today, because like I said, we just scratched the surface. If I didn't get to your question, feel free to put it into that forum. We will get to it. And if we don't know the answers, we'll find you an expert that does know the answers, because we certainly aren't experts on every single thing in the world. And absolutely, if a couple of people are asking for some follow-up conversations, let me put hello@weallcount.com is the place to email, and we will get back to you. And we will see you next Friday when same Zoom link, same time. And we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of thinking about things in gaps. If we're doing work on equity or disparities, what are the great reasons to kind of frame research questions and conduct analysis in terms of gaps? And what are the equity disadvantages of that? How does that sometimes accidentally still center dominant privileged groups of people? It means the world to us that you want to hang out together for an hour on Fridays and try and dig through some of the really nitty gritty, complicated questions about, we all want equity in our data. How do we actually get there? And the answer is we are going to have to get there together. So the fact that you wanted to be together and hang out for an hour is absolutely the highlight of my week, every single week. I am so, so grateful for your time. Let us know. We All Count really exists to build tools and build opportunities that meet your needs. So if you have needs for a tool or a resource or have a question, genuinely let us know. And that's how we decide what to do next. So we will leave it there. Have a great rest of your week. Bye, everybody.